Welcome and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and for this webinar session, I'm joined by Tyrone Shandiman from Strata Insurance Solutions. In this webinar, we're talking about floods, flood insurance, and insurance claims. Tyrone has a presentation on this topic, and then we'll move on to questions. As this webinar is a national webinar, if Tyrone refers to state legislation, he will mention which state's legislation he's referring to. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information contained in this session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in this session. Very shortly, we'll bring Tyrone Shandiman to the screen from Strata Insurance Solutions. Tyrone began his insurance career in 2004, working in various roles within the financial services industry. In 2011, Tyrone established an insurance broking firm. The business has grown to service over 500 clients with a team of 4 and a strong specialisation in strata insurance. Tyrone's key focus is building long-term relationships by servicing clients in line with the key principles of advice, value, trust, and choice. Tyrone and Strata Insurance Solutions recently celebrated 10 years of supporting lot owners, communities, and strata buildings Australia-wide. In 2016, Tyrone was awarded Queensland's Young Insurance Broker of the Year. This is awarded to insurance brokers under 35 who exhibit an outstanding level of professionalism and integrity. Tyrone is a very regular contributor to the LookUpStrata site. He provides articles plus answers many of the strata insurance questions we receive in. His responses regularly appear in our twice weekly newsletters and monthly or bi-monthly magazines. We have over 1,000 blog articles on the LookUpStrata site, and Tyrone has authored or co-authored over 60 of these. This is the 4th time he's joined us for a webinar. At the very beginning of this year, Tyrone broke the record for the largest number of registrations for a single LookUpStrata webinar. I think we almost hit 1,000 registrations. And the recording of Tyrone's session all of them together provide so much value for our audience that they're watched hundreds and hundreds of times on our YouTube channel. And good news for all of us, we have just secured a date for Tyrone's next webinar, which will be later in the year. And I'm sure Tyrone will tell you about this during the session. So we welcome Tyrone again for joining us, and great to have you here for this timely information, Tyrone.
Thank you. Good to be with you. All right, let me bring this presentation up.
Thanks very much.
Just a second. Okay, excellent. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with the LookUpStrata team for the 4th time. I thought today it would be a really good and topical issue to talk about flood insurance, given we've recently had events in Queensland and New South Wales. Now, this presentation, it is designed for people who are viewing it today, but what I am hoping is possibly in future when there are flooding events, this might be very topical for people who are going through a flooding event at that time. So what I'm going to talk about today, let me just check if I can go to next slide, just a sec. Okay, fantastic. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is the exclusions for flood insurance are often misunderstood. So I wanted to talk about considerations when buying a strata policy and also when claiming. Now, I do just want to make it very clear that whilst this is a strata presentation, because the definitions of flood across general insurance are often the same, many of these slides and much of what I'm talking about today may apply to other lines of insurance like home insurance and business insurance and so on. So I thought I'd start today with the definition of flood. So what is flood? Now, the definition of flood is often misconceived, but essentially for most insurers, and you should check your policy wording for the exact definition, but it is the covering of normally dry land with water released or that has escaped the normal confines of any watercourse, river, lake, creek, reservoir, canal, or dam. Now, if you're in a flooding event, the easiest way to make this definition easy, you may get rid of the last 7 or 8 words, and you might say, for example, if you're in the Brisbane catchment, you might say from the normal confines of the Brisbane River. And that can really help simplify this flood definition for you if you want to better define that when you're considering whether you've got a flooding event. Now, I do get calls all the time from people who say, I need flood insurance because if a pipe bursts in my house and it floods the property, I want to make sure I'm covered for flood. Now, I want to make it very clear that flood is defined as in the previous slide. And common misconceptions about what flood is can include localized flooding from blocked drains or from a severe downpour event where the water is not from one of those bodies of water in my previous slide. So just keep in mind that it's not every event is a flood event. And sometimes in a flood event, you might have a non-flood event and a flood event at the same time or in concurrent events as well. So I thought I'd dedicate the majority of this presentation today to claims because I know that it's most topical for policyholders when we're dealing with claims, or that's where I find we get the most questions from our clients. So when you have a flooding event, now I do just want to say that when we talk about flood and the exclusion, if you have flood insurance, some of this doesn't apply to you because if you've got flood insurance, you're insured, so we don't need to consider the flood exclusion. But if you have a flood exclusion, it can be difficult to determine the flood exclusion for both the insurer, the insured, and ourselves. And insurers will use a range of tools to determine that. So that could include things like flood mapping and council reports from the insurance reports from the Insurance Council. If there is a question over or a dispute over whether your property is a flooding event, or if there's some concerns and questions, insurers will err on the side of caution and engage a hydrologist to do a site-specific report. So if you believe that you have a dispute over a flooding event, you may want to firstly ask the insurer to consider that as part of their assessment of your claim as well. Now, I wanted to talk to you about the Wayne tank principle, and this is a question I've had before where if you have an event where there is a flooding event, but that's happening at the same time as another water event or another event, how does the policy respond? So for example, if you had floodwaters rising and that was 80% of the claim, and you had rainwater coming down and that was 20% of the claim, does the insurer pay 20% of the claim because 20% was associated with a covered event? There's a court case that has gone through the courts on which we know as the Wayne tank court case and the Wayne tank principle. And effectively, what that says is that if you have damage that comes from an excluded event, in this case flood, and an insured event, in this case other water damage, then at the same time, then the exclusion is operable and the claim does not respond. Now, it's very important to understand two things, that this Wayne tank principle happens only in concurrent events. So that is where there is water damage from an insured event and an excluded event at the same time. If you have consecutive events where you have an insured event first, and then the excluded event happens at some time later, then there is potentially a claim for the insured event up until the point at which damage started occurring from the excluded event. So it's very important to understand that while you may have two events happening and in principle the exclusion applies, sometimes there is a claim in instances where there are consecutive events and the insured event happens first. Now I'm going to talk about an example later on in today's presentation about a consecutive event that we've had paid for a client. Now, the application of the exclusion, it is the insurer's responsibility to demonstrate that the exclusion applies. What that means is it is more onerous on the insurer than the insured when it comes to applying the exclusion, because the insurer has to put all the evidence forward and has to demonstrate that there is an exclusion. And if they can't do it, then the exclusion doesn't apply. Whereas for the policyholder, they don't have to do anything in terms of demonstrating an exclusion. There may be steps though if there is a dispute with the insurer. Now, this slide particularly for people that are going through a flooding event in the future and are reviewing this webinar at a later date. If you are in a flooding event, I really want you to take notice of this particular slide, because what I want you to do when you have notice of a flooding event is I want you to look for things that may not be flood. All right, this can include the arrival of water before the flooding event occurred. You'll know that when the flooding occurs because the news will report on it at a certain time. So was there water in your property prior to flooding waters arriving? Other things are things like pump failures, water entering through utility infrastructure and sewage pipes, and other infrastructure such as backflow valves, and also whether there was water from overflowing pipes, drains or gutters, or whether there was anything else at play as well. If that is occurring, record keeping is essential. In fact, it's been essential for me in fighting $1 million claim with an insurer. And it is essential that you keep a record of what is happening. So I recommend that you put together a statement of what has occurred with dates and times, what you saw, what was being damaged, and also supporting evidence such as photos and videos. And in fact, sometimes the supporting evidence could be a text from you to someone else saying, oh, there's this happening at our property. And that is a date stamped evidence of what is occurring as well. So sometimes the supporting evidence goes beyond photos and videos, and it's actually emails and other things that you can show and use as evidence of what's happened at your property. So record keeping is essential if you believe you have a claim that is not related to flood in a flooding event. Now, if you are wanting to put forward a consideration to the insurer about a claim in a flooding event that is not flood related, I highly recommend you do your research. Now, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, which I will refer to as AFCA, publish decisions on past disputes that they have given a determination on. Now, what this gives you the benefit of doing is seeing how they've ruled in the past on past disputes. And they have a very good search function. If you Google AFCA search decisions, it brings up a search, and if I've got time at the end of this presentation, I'll go into this a little bit more. But effectively, if you go the advanced search option, you can even search terms. So you might search Wayne Tank with the keyword flood and bring up all of the decisions that have been published by AFCA on flood claims for Wayne Tank. What you really want to focus on is claims that have been found in favour of the insured, and those decisions can often provide you with the arguments as to why your claim should be paid. So I highly recommend, before you speak to insurers and try to get your claim paid, do your research before you do that. Now, if there is a dispute over flood insurance, there is a process that is followed, okay? Now, the first process in the claim is speaking with your claims handler. Now, if they suggest that your claim may not be paid, I highly recommend that you exhaust each of these individual dispute processes as much as you can, because what you might find is that you have a sympathetic ear with the claims handler, or a more sympathetic ear with the claims handler that you may not have in other processes. So I do get clients sometimes say to me, oh, well, the insurer's saying, no, let's refer it straight to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. Well, firstly, you can't do that. But secondly, it's not in your interest to not exhaust every single avenue that you possibly can. So I recommend not referring disputes automatically to dispute resolution, but instead trying to resolve it at each step of the way. Now, if you can't resolve it with the claims handler, it then goes to the insurer's dispute resolution, and they have 15 business days to respond. And finally, if that's not satisfactory to you, you can go to Australian Financial Complaints Authority for claims up to $542,500. Now, keep in mind here that if you've got 10 lots damaged and $1 million of the claim's $1 million, you may consider breaking that claim down into a few lots and making the claim a bit smaller, so you could have a chance of taking that to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. Just keep in mind the response time is possibly a year or more. All right, I don't agree with that, but it is a year or more. And that can be a very long wait for you if you've got a property that has flood damage that is not insured. The decision is not binding on you, but it is binding on the insurer. And beyond the Financial Complaints Authority, if you're not happy with the outcome, you can take litigation. That will cost you. Likewise, if your claim's over $542,000, you can litigate it as well. If you need to lodge a dispute, having a really good insurance broker is very helpful in the process and very cost effective. So that's one of the benefits of using a broker, is that they should, in theory, dispute your claim for you. Obviously, you'll get varying levels of competency in that area, but having a really good insurance broker is important in this process. Now, if you're not covered, there are some things to consider as well. So, do you have other policies that might have a flood cover in them? So we know in Strata that you have to have contents and landlord's cover, or you should have that cover. They may have specific benefits in the policy, like loss of rent, temporary accommodation, prevention of access and food spoilage. Likewise, is there government assistance available? We know that when there's major events, government do provide some assistance and handouts. And finally, do not wait for the dispute process to finalise. You have to take action as a prudent uninsured. And that can mean, and what that means in a flooding event is, don't wait for your house to get mouldy and more damaged. Take your action early, prevent further loss and minimise your loss, particularly if it's not insured as well. Now, I just wanted to give you a case study of an $1 million claim that was initially declined by an insurer that we got paid for a client. This was an event in Townsville. There were 38, it was a 3-story complex. 38 lots had varying levels of water inundation. 8 lots in one block had severe inundation. The flood inundation went up to 1 meter on the walls, or up to 1 meter in those lots. Now, what pricked my interest with this client was that they told me that there was sewage coming through the pipes and the toilets before the arrival of floodwater. And that pricked my interest to say to the client, let's get together a statement as to what has happened here. Now, the insurer initially declined the claim, but I felt that there were grounds for this to be covered. And going back to the slide on going back to the definition firstly, so the first slide, what I felt was that the water coming through the sewerage pipes was not water that had been released or escaped from the normal confines of, in this instance, Ross River. So what we said was that there was an initial inundation of water that was not flood water into this client's property, and that the Wayne tank principle only applied when the flood waters and the sewage waters were happening at the same time. So the first inundation of water was insured by the policy, was our argument. And going back to the Wayne tank slides, it applies in this instance because you had the inundation first, and then at a certain point of time, an inundation of sewage and flooding at the same time. And this just kind of gives you a diagram to kind of show the argument we put forward to the insurer, that on the left-hand side of the screen, you have a normal toilet with the pipe and sewage waters and so on. In the middle, what it shows is that sewage water was being pushed up through the toilet and through the pipes. And to what extent that was Ross River water is very hard to determine. And we kind of explained to the insurer that not only would it be once the water from Ross River came through those pipes, but at what point can you demonstrate that that was Ross River water? And it's very hard for the insurer to do so. So where we landed in this claim was that there was an inundation of 5 centimeters of sewage water that had occurred in this claim. And we agreed on 5 centimeters because, look, if it was just water coming through the toilets, it would escape through crevices and cracks in the building. You would not get a 1 meter inundation from sewage, water and pipes. So we landed on a 5 centimeter inundation of sewage. And the benefit for this client really was that the treatment of a sewage claim is very different to other water damage claims. So you have to, in such instances, strip gyp rock up to a meter high in that event, and you have to remove cabinetry and do other things for sanitation purposes. So in this case, the 8 lots got a $1.1 million settlement for a 5 centimeter inundation of floodwaters. Now, because the insurer quoted their builder, which is not the builder themselves, they're actually a project manager, and it was through a catastrophic event, the quoted costs were higher than what you would normally expect as well. So what came from that is that I don't believe a single owner in those 8 lots were behind from a financial perspective, even though the insurer only covered 5 centimeters of a 1 meter flooding event. So that was a really, really good outcome. I do have to say that the insurer was very fair in that claim. So, but we also did put a very good case forward to the insurer as well. I lastly just wanted to go through a couple more slides on buying a policy and considerations when taking out a policy, because this is also very important. I get asked all the time, do I need flood cover? And that question depends solely on your flood exposure. Now, insurance brokers aren't hydrologists, so we don't give advice on exposure. But what I'd like to do is refer a client. If you're in a flood zone, your council should have flood mapping available to you. So the best place to start is looking at flood mapping that is available. Now, just keep in mind that past floods don't predict future floods, but it can give you an idea as to what your exposure is. A second thing you might do, this is not as accurate as flood mapping, but you may just do a quick review on Google to see how close your property is in proximity to a body of water that's excluded under a flood exclusion. Now, why it's not accurate is that you could be 100 or 50 meters from a riverbank, but you could be 10 meters above the floodplain. And likewise, you could be kilometers away, but still on a floodplain. So it's not as accurate, but it might give you a bit of an indication. And finally, if you're still not sure, then I recommend engaging a hydrologist to do a site-specific report on your property. Now, lastly, I get asked all the time, or I get calls from owners who are very concerned because there is a disagreement between the committee or the owners as to whether you should take flood cover out. And I thought what I might do is I might explain what you can do if you're one of those owners that really wants flood cover and you have committee or other owners that have differing views. My first recommendation is act in good faith with the committee and the other owners and put a good case forward as to why you believe you should take flood cover out. Often I get owners that are very emotive and they get the committee and the owners offside because they approach it in an emotive way. Put your case forward in a constructive manner to the committee and owners. And what you might do firstly is gather the data on flood exposure through flood mapping for your property. If there is a flood exposure, that should be brought to the attention of the committee. Now, a really good argument around flood cover is that some lenders will require that you have flood cover for your property before they will offer a loan. So by not taking out flood cover, it can sometimes devalue units if a buyer can't secure a loan because you don't have flood cover. So that is a really good argument to put to the committee and owners when they're deciding on flood. And if you've got an instance where you're on the ground floor and you're trying to advocate people on the upper floors who have the majority vote, you might just kind of appeal to them and say, if you were insuring this building in its entirety, would you not insure for flood? And the last and probably most important thing that will be considered is how much is it going to cost and what are the excesses. Now, as an owner, you might ask the broker or strata manager if they can put some costings together for you, so you can consider putting a motion to the committee or the owners at a general meeting. So that kind of covers off what I was going to speak to you today about flood insurance. I know that this is obviously a very topical discussion at the moment with what's going on in major flooding events. And hopefully this gives people some information about flood, not just now, but hopefully this is something people can reflect on in the future when we have future flooding events as well. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Nikki now for some questions.
Thanks so much, Tyrone. That was really, really informative. And I think, yeah, definitely it will be a great resource for people to refer back to. Just to let everyone know, we've been asked a few times, just not in the general chat, but to us directly, whether we'll be sharing the presentation in the slides, and just confirming that that will be happening later on today. And the recording of the session is always up on our YouTube channel, so it'll always be there for people to refer back to. And Tyrone, we were speaking before the session, and Tyrone mentioned it would be great to, if we can pop it into future newsletters if we do have any flood events happening, and we'll certainly be doing that just to keep people informed and to help out as much as we can in the future if similar events. Hopefully it won't occur again like it did earlier this year, but if that does happen again, we've got that resource there now. So thanks so much, Tyrone. That was really informative. Now, we've had some questions that were sent in, and we've also had some come in during the chat while we're speaking, but I'm just letting everyone know it's a really great time now to ask a question if you've got something that you'd like to know about the presentation, or something that you'd like to know from Tyrone. We can pick his brains while he's here. He's got so much information to share. So we'll just go to one of the questions that was submitted, Tyrone, which was from Kevin in New South Wales. And he asked, we recently had water ingress in both of our bedrooms. The issues are being fixed by a builder and paid for by the Owners Corporation via a special levy. The carpets need replacing because of water damage. Strata insists this is my responsibility and I need to claim the replacement of the carpets through my contents insurance. Why is this?
Good question. Okay, so this is probably a water damage question, not a flood question, which really goes to the first slide around the misconceptions of flood. But because I've presented on water damage, I'm more than happy to answer this question anyway. I guess really what it comes down to is that under the strata legislation, carpets are not covered by insurance. So unless if you can demonstrate that the body corporate are legally responsible to pay for your carpets otherwise, then it doesn't fall under a strata insurance policy. So I do have a really good presentation through LookUpStrata on water damage, and I would probably recommend that the owner look back at that presentation, because it will contain, it contains similar questions and it will contain that answer as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tyrone. And what we might do, we might just mention that webinar in the email that goes out later today and place a link in there so people can actually catch up with that as well. That was the session that we had record numbers for earlier in the year. So as I mentioned, we had about 1,000 people register for it, and we've had so much great feedback from it. It contains lots of case studies and actually traces the water through the apartment and shows how the claims are. It was a really great session. So we'll certainly include that, and you can have a look at that as well, and that will be really helpful too. Okay, so we had a couple of questions that came in during the session, so we just refer back to those. So we had one coming in from Andrew, and I'm not sure, this might be a little bit complicated for today, and we might have to sort of get back to Andrew outside of the session, but it might be interesting to have a chat about it. So Andrew's from Victoria, and he's asked, confirming that water ingress from communal drainage issues, a faulty sump and pump, is not flooding. So he's just asking for confirmation about that. We've had issues as a result of stormwater overflow in a combination of water tanks overflow from our next door neighbour. What is this classed as? Water overflow is a reoccurrence and strata won't cover us. The neighbour issues occurred at the same time. It will likely involve up to 4 insurers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. This really does come down to the question of, does it fit the definition of flood? And and unless if the water has come from a lake, river, dam, canal, watercourse, or other body of water in the exclusion, the flood exclusion isn't operable. So just on face value, obviously we don't know the full circumstances, but on face value, I would say that this is a claim that does not have the flood claim that is operable. You're really going to need a good insurance broker to help you navigate this claim, because if the insurer is saying it's not covered, you'd want to understand why it's not covered and what are the exclusions in the policy that they're referring to as well. So from on face value, and I will say a lot of these hypothetical scenarios, without knowing the full details and seeing hydrologist reports that might be 55 pages long, I can give you a general overview of my thoughts, but obviously the devil might be in the detail of what is in those reports as well. But happy to share my views based on what we know in the questions provided today.
Thanks, Tyrone. Thanks for that clarification too. Sorry, I'm just jumping in and out of chat while I'm speaking with you. So just bear with me again. It's getting a bit busy in there, which is really great to see. Debbie from Queensland asked, have you ever had solicitor costs approved to be paid out under an approved indemnity claim?
Oh, okay. So I'm presuming this may be not related to flood. Look, this is a very difficult, because it depends. There are some clauses in policy wordings around claims preparation costs and so on. Often the claims preparation costs need to be approved by the insurer, but when it comes to things like disputes, solicitors' fees can be considered if it's found by the Australian Financial Complaints Authority that it was necessary to engage a solicitor at that time. So very hard, again, without knowing all of the detail. I would say that there is a possibility that you could have them paid, but there's also some conditions around that as well in the policies.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Now, we did have a question come up from somebody asking, and I've lost it now, whether we can refer, can you recommend a good legal company to deal with these complicated issues? Now, everyone's probably aware we send out the New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and WA Strata magazines, either monthly or bi-monthly. And in the back of those magazines, we do have our directory, and there are always some really great resources in there that you can catch up with some people that, they're usually people that contribute to our site quite regularly. So they're giving information back to the community, and we really recommend that you have a look there, and you can probably get some great contacts out of that directory at the end of the magazines.
And can I just add, Nikki, that when it comes to insurance, you sometimes don't need to engage a lawyer. Sometimes if you've got a good insurance broker, they should be managing the dispute process for you up until the point at which the Australian Financial Complaints Authority has handed down their decision. So, if you're being mindful of how you're spending lot owners' money or your money, then I would highly recommend, firstly, if you've got a broker, to utilise them as much as you can as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, then we had Catherine from Victoria asking, do you recommend increasing insurance cover due to the current risk and increasing costs of replacement of repair, or does the insurer take this into consideration?
Yeah, look, insurers do take it into consideration. Brokers don't advise on how much you should insure for, because that's what a quantity surveyor does. Now, I know depending on which state we're asking the question from, but I know in Queensland and Victoria, you have to get a valuation done every 5 years. We actually recommend that in states where that's not a requirement, like New South Wales and other states in Australia. And the reason why is that at that interval, your property should be escalated by the quantity surveyor, and there is oversight as to whether your sum insured is correct as well. Generally, insurers will increase the sum insured by about 3 to 6%. Brokers will often just hand that on to clients, but give them the opportunity to say, hey, we want more or less.
Okay, thank you. Then we had Rena from Queensland saying, in the Brisbane area, are there strata insurers offering policies with no flood cover?
Yes. So actually, what we find in strata is that there's one insurer. specifically. So CHU and Flex, they will automatically include flood cover if you're not in a flood zone, but the others, it's an optional cover that you have to request. So there's quite a few insurers that offer no flood cover options when they provide quotes.
Okay, thanks, Tyrone. Then we've got one from New South Wales. This one's from Cliff. How long can an insurance provider take to give an answer on a claim after a storm bomb inundates an area? Example, in Ballina, New South Wales, all we hear is they are still waiting for hydrologist reports. It's been over 3 months already.
Yes. My understanding is that they have 4 months under the General Insurance Code of Practice. But what I would recommend you do, I don't know the answer off the top of my head because there are provisions for catastrophic events, but the General Insurance Code of Practice, Google that, and it does actually provide specific timeframes as to when insurers are required to respond, including in catastrophic events. But I believe it is 4 months, but I would recommend researching that. If the insurer is exceeding that time, you may want to remind them of their requirements under the Code of Practice as well.
Okay, all right. Now we've got one from WA that came in from Suzanne, and she's asking, water travels and sometimes years later one gets bubbling on concrete surfaces. Any comment?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so look, the strata policies or the accidental damage policies, strata policies, will cover sudden and accidental damage, not otherwise excluded. So if you've got issues where paint bubbles, I would say that it would be very hard for that from a water event. I would say that would be very hard for it to fall under the definition of sudden and accidental. But by all means, it really does come down to the specifics of how long that has been, over what period of time, and what are the contributing factors as to what has caused that damage. And particularly if the insurer's paid a claim in the past and the bubbling has happened after that claim's been paid, that might also be a consideration as well, Sue.
Thank you. We're in Queensland from Ernest. How regular to review flood cover with respect to current market changes, building cost escalations to mitigate risk? Is this considered under flood cover? Yeah,
so flood cover, the policy either excludes or does not exclude flood cover. So anything else you do, that's the main thing you've got to understand is there a flood exclusion in your policy? In terms of how often you should be considering this, I guess that really does depend. I mean, effectively, if you've been on the committee for 10 or so years, you looked at the flood exposure years ago, there's been no changes to flooding events in your area, the previous review might still be relevant to you at that point in time. Obviously, if there's been a flooding event which changes things between now and then, that might also be cause for review. And likewise, if you're a new committee member or a new committee and you don't know if there's been a review done in the past, that's also a good opportunity and time to review whether you need or whether you should consider flood as well.
Excellent. Okay, and Stephanie from Queensland, so this is a bit long, I haven't read through this one yet, so I hope it's relevant. So Stephanie in Queensland has asked, the commercial building next to us suffered a flooded basement car park, which blew up their transformer and effectively took out our power source. The access to other transformers was via boxing on the border, and the housing flashing for the transformer was on our side of the boundary, and emergency services damaged the housing in gaining access. Body Corporate paid for a generator to maintain power levels to our medium-rise residential complex for a week while the power was being restored. Should we be covered for reimbursement of repair to the housing and generator hire costs? We are not flood affected directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe that there is a potential claim for, presuming that there's damage that's occurred from this event, I do believe that there are grounds to review a claim. I would highly recommend that you get the circumstances lodged in with your insurer. If you've got a broker, you also seek advice from them as to whether there should be a claim under the policy as well. But from what I'm hearing, definitely something that I would get lodged and get a determination on, keeping in mind that the insurer will get reports which will outline the cause and so on. And once that's provided to you, you'll have a better understanding of how the policy does respond.
Sorry. We do still have a few questions coming through, but I know, Tyrone, you mentioned that you might be able to show us the search function that you mentioned during your presentation. I think it would be great if you could jump in there and do that, and then we might jump back to questions at the end and see how many more we can cover.
Yeah,
is that suitable?
Yeah, this is really, really something that I've used when I've been dealing with clients' claims. This is a really, really good way of finding out what the adjudicator has said in past decisions. So you go to afca.org.au and then you go what to expect, search published decisions. Okay. Now, what you can do here is if you've got a flood claim for a certain event and you're not sure, you might be able to see what the formerly the Ombudsman, an adjudicator at AFCA, has said about those claims in the past. So for example, if you've got flood and you want to, now advanced search is a really good search tool because you can also add phrases, for example, Wayne Tank, right? You can also filter it down to certain policy types. I would probably mainly go with general insurance here, because what we find is that the exclusion is fairly similar across home, business, and strata insurance as well. But if you wanted a more defined strata specific response, you could also go down to the residential strata title product as well. So you then do a search. Now, this is brought up for searches. What I then do is so these are PDF documents. I will open all 4 of them, or it does 10 per page. I'll open up the 10 pages. And then what I then do is I go and find the outcome that is determined by the insurer. Sometimes it's at the end of the document, sometimes it's at the start. So it does say here that they weren't in breach of their obligation under the Act, but it does say that they're liable to meet the applicant's loss in accordance with the terms of the policy. So that demonstrates that it is in favour of the insured in some respects. And then what I then go and do is understand if the background relates to the claim or if there's anything similar, and then I'll read the reasons for the decision from the adjudicator and see if there's anything that really pops out that they're saying that says, here is what the case law says, or so on. So this is a really helpful search tool. If you have a dispute with an insurer, I always go to AFCA to see what they've ruled on in the past. And sometimes it does actually help in realizing that, yes, you have a dispute, but sometimes it really helps to say, actually, we're probably going down the wrong path here as well, because I can't find a case that is in favour. So generally what I'll do is I'll start by looking at all the decisions in favour of an insured, and then I'll also then, if need be, look at decisions that weren't in favour and find out why that was. So if you are looking to dispute a claim with an insurer, or if you're just not sure whether your claim is covered, this might be a good reference point for you to see how AFCA has ruled on this in the past.
Thank you so much, Tyrone. I am sure that will be very, very useful to lots of our viewers here. And now, I mentioned at the very beginning, right in the introduction, that we have secured a date to have you back for another webinar in the future. And I don't think we've shared with our audience what that is. So probably now is a really great time to share that. So would you like to let us know what the next webinar will be?
Yeah, absolutely. So the next webinar, what I wanted to talk with LookUpStrata viewers is dispute resolution, okay? And how to construct a dispute that will go to the insurer and the Financial Complaints Authority. there's a lot more that goes into it than just simply saying, I want to refer this to dispute resolution. If you want to put a really good case forward, I'm going to show you how you do that. One of those things is what I've just discussed then, but I'm also going to show you how to structure your dispute so that it is professional and clear and concise and covers off on what you're trying to say as well. So that's, I believe that's in October or November later this year, or that's when it's scheduled for. So yes, we'll definitely look forward to presenting to LookUpStrata viewers at that stage as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Tyrone. I think that will be a great session. And we are looking to limit the session numbers in the future. So we'll be limiting them to 500 people because we're just having so many people sign up for the events and it gets really busy in chat and it's a little bit hard to sort of mediate it while we're in here. So when you see that come up, I can't remember, we've scheduled so many for the rest of the year that I can't remember the actual date of the session, but it will come up like it always does at least 2 or maybe even 3 weeks before the event. So just make sure when you see that in our newsletter, which will either be on the Monday or the Wednesday newsletter, jump straight in there and register so that you can be here for that, because that will be a really, really excellent session as well. So keep an eye out for that in the future. And now we might just jump back into, we've still got a couple of questions and we should have enough time, hopefully, to get to them. So we'll see how we go. So we had one from Suzanne from WA asking, with water ingress, whether from flood or other, it can lead to mould, which is a health issue. However, delays in insurance processing and sometimes body corporate committees don't seem to care. What advice can you give me as a homeowner?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so all policies have a provision in them that you are authorised to take emergency actions to prevent further loss and make safe. Now, an insurer can't unreasonably deny that for you. We have had some disputes with insurers over the cost of those repairs, because I know that there are some water damage emergency companies that really charge excessive costs, and they're through the roof. The best thing you can do if you have a claim is to just call the insurer. If you've got the insurer's name and your policy number, and they can appoint one of their make safe contractors to come out and review that for you. So what we say and what's on our website, we recommend clients to go, if it's out of hours, to go directly to the insurer or to call us directly. But if you don't have the benefit of knowing who your insurer is and who your policy is with, you do have the ability to expend funds at your cost, but later be reimbursed for those costs from the insurer, provided they can be demonstrated as being reasonable.
Thank you. Hopefully that will help, Suzanne, with your issue in WA. All right, Catherine from Victoria is saying, can roof insulation also form part of the claim for flood damage rather than only external walls, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So look, anything that is damaged by flooding, including insulation panels and anything else can be considered as part of the claim. In terms of whether that's strata or not, look, strata covers permanent fixtures. I would say that it would be reasonable that the insulation was covered under the strata policy, but failing that, if the insurer denies it, you should then make a claim under your contents insurance for the roof insulation panels.
Okay, and this one is a little bit related. So this one is from Queensland, from Stephanie asking, artificial turf on a rooftop terrace. There's terrible mould and lime leaching from outdoor tiles due to extreme and prolonged rain events. Should this be eligible for replacement?
Look, I don't think that will fall under the definition of sudden and accidental damage. I do believe that the artificial turf, once it gets mouldy, there are exclusions for mould as well. So look, the general idea is that if you've got property that's exposed to elements and that causes damage, I find that those claims are very difficult to get covered. I would find the mouldy artificial turf would be something that is a maintenance issue as opposed to something covered by strata insurance.
Okay, and then we've got one from Teresa from New South Wales. Saying our strata manager took out a policy without any advice or quotes presented to the OC. This did not cover flood insurance and we suffered a loss due to storm damage or flooding during that time. When we became aware of it, we cancelled and took out a new policy, but there will be a claim for damage during the first policy. What are our rights for this? Should we be financially responsible for costs associated with processing the claim, etc.?
Yeah, look, this is a really difficult situation, and it's not entirely the strata manager's fault. All right. So just keep in mind that there is oversight when a policy is taken out as to, firstly, owners must vote on a motion in a general meeting, but also the committee may also be given the policy terms and conditions and approve that policy as well. Look, this could be a very complex question around who is responsible for what, and without knowing the exact circumstances. But I do find for strata managers that it is hard to pin a claim on a strata manager where they've followed the processes and given the policy terms and conditions to the relevant parties.
Okay, and then we just had one through from Anawa asking, thanks for your extensive discussion on flood cover. I know my question's not related to flood directly, but the roofer went to restore the roof. Afterwards, because of the last heavy rain, there are several units that got leaks from the roof. Who is cover from through this insurance, or is it the roofer's insurance?
Good question.
New South Wales.
Yep, really good question. So look, in this case, what you would do, you would lodge a claim on your strata policy. You would make sure that the insurer is aware that that this could have been as a result of the roofer's actions. And the insurer will decide at the end of a claim whether it is appropriate to recover against the roofer for the claim. You can go through the roofer and submit a letter of demand, but that's going to be a very prolonged process. It will go through the roofer's liability insurance, and the liability insurer doesn't specifically have the same duty to you as the property insurer, in that they're not bound by time to get a response back to you. So I would recommend in this instance, unless if it's a really small claim that you've fixed and got paid for, and you're not waiting on anything, I'd firstly recommend making a claim on your strata insurance and having your insurer follow up a recovery against the roofer.
Okay, hopefully that helps with that situation. Then we had a question from Paula asking, you mentioned rivers, lakes, creeks, reservoirs, canals and dams. Is a marina also included in this definition? So
a marina, I believe that would be sea. So there is an exclusion in the policy for actions of the sea, sea water and storm surge. And a marina could also be considered a watercourse as well. So if your property is damaged from water from a marina, I would say there's a high possibility that there's an exclusion in the policy, whether that be the sea, storm surge, or the term watercourse in flood could be excluded as well.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yes.
Okay, from Andrew asking, and I can't remember which state Andrew was from. I might have it back here. Victoria. Yep. So renewal time and broker informed that no one will cover us for water damage other than our current insurer due to previous events. Premiums have gone up 20% and excess by up to 50%. We're over a barrel, which with seemingly no options. Advice.
Good question. So look, there are instances where due to, this is a water damage claim, not necessarily a flood issue, but I will answer it. So there are instances where you can have a series of water damage claims on a claims history, which can, in the worst case scenario, render a building uninsurable, or if not, insurers impose very heavy penalties on the building for that history. The best thing you can do in this instance is firstly go to market, get as many quotes as you possibly can from as many insurers, just to ensure that you are getting the best possible outcome for your building. Now, if that doesn't render a better result, the only other thing you can really do is encourage owners to prevent water damage claims from happening. So there is a number of things you can do to prevent claims, such as undertaking maintenance and so on. And that's in our water damage presentation from the last webinar around what you can do to prevent water damage claims from occurring as well.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you. Now, I think we've just about covered all the questions, which is fantastic. Thanks, Tyrone. That was, I think covered about 14 or something in that time, so that was excellent. And just coming up to the end, we'd always like to ask our presenters if they've got some information they'd like to share with us, some good news. I know you do lots of advocacy in Far North Queensland to do with the reinsurance pool, so anything that you can fill us in that area?
Yeah, look, some updates at the moment. So we know that the reinsurance pool for Northern Australia is set to come in place on the 1st of July. We're getting a lot of feedback from insurers at the moment that this was in late May, that they hadn't received the modelling from the federal government on the reinsurance pool at that point. So what we are finding is it's unlikely that anyone will offer policies from the 1st of July with the reinsurance pool included. So we are setting a bit of an expectation with clients and policyholders that it may not be as soon as what was thought and what was announced. So, but just keep watching this space, because there'll be more announcements with the North Australia reinsurance pool in due course.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tyrone. And we do have quite a few readers and viewers that live up in that area there. So we like to keep them informed, and we'll certainly, through you, thank you very much for keeping us updated all the time on it. We'll get information out as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. There will be media releases coming out shortly on that as well. So you'll get that to share with the readers.
Excellent. Okay, that's great. And we'll try and get those out because it's our quickest way of getting information out to you. It will be in either a Monday or a Wednesday newsletter after Tyrone contacts us. So keep an eye out in those newsletters, so you'll see that update come through. Thank you so much, Tyrone, for coming on and sharing such detailed information, and it's really practical, and it gives our readers and our audience access to information they probably wouldn't have had access to otherwise.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always presenting today. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this educational session. If you gained value from the information, please like this video. You can also engage further with LookUpStrata by subscribing to our YouTube channel or by being kept informed about Strata news via our regular newsletters. Our subscribe link is listed in the description box below.